Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Steindl Center. We are starting today, as you probably noticed from our ads, especially the one in Jerusalem Post, starting a new series on the neglected but yet unforgotten, which dealing with this era of time between the sealing of the Talmud in the 5th century till the Rishonim, or beginning of the Rishonim, starting around 1000. This series will be available also online. We'd like everybody to enjoy themselves, and without any further introduction, the Rabbi.
I have to say, ladies and gentlemen, and are there any children here? No. Okay. It's a pity. It is perhaps something that I shouldn't say to you, but there's a question that I asked, possibly in every country that I have been for more than 2 days, and the question was mostly, you look at children, say children. Say, the ideal age for children is about, I suppose, when they are, it is written even in Midrash, when they are around 4 years old. And then, if you look at children of this age, all of them are handsome and clever. Now the question is, what happens to them with the time? Now, I asked it. Now, I'll just tell you that about cleverness, what happens to their minds. See, you sometimes sit with little children and you enjoy their sharpness, their creativity, their ability to absorb, to absorb things. What happens to them? What happens to them? So about the intellectual side, most of the people that I spoke with told me that the schools are doing it. I mean, the schools are destroying the children. And therefore, the more you learn in schools, say, אני חושב שזה עדיין לא מספיק גבוה. אני חושב מה אי אפשר לעשות? אוקיי, טוב. So, schools are basically institutions for stupefying children, and so they do it. If you didn't do it enough, as we call in the elementary school, you continue to do it in the high school, and if you don't do it in the high school, you go to the university, and then you are sure they are stupid enough, so they can become teachers, fathers, and so on. My other question was, what happens to the beauty? It's very hard. I mean, you can find from time to time ugly children, but it's really uncommon. Most children are handsome. What happens to them later? See, why don't they remain as handsome as they were when they were 4 years old? Why when say 40 years pass or 60 years pass, they are not as handsome as they were then? It's a good question, and I didn't receive a good answer for it. Okay, I'm just asking you a question. But anyway, no children here. So let me just do it this time because we are beginning. We are supposed to have a series of lectures. Series of lectures that will be mostly about one period, not a very short time. I would say, generally speaking, something about a span is about 500 years. But these years that I'm speaking about are years in which we have very little information about the people that live there, even about very general affairs that happened there at those times. I mean, we just don't know enough, especially even in places that were later on we have more and more information about, but in the beginning we don't have enough. So I picked up 7 names of people that are in some way, first of all, they are significant in one way or another. Some of them are well known. Some of them are well known, comparatively speaking. See, I'll come to it possibly. My next time will be Rav Saadia Gaon. Rav Saadia Gaon is not an unknown personality. And he left behind him a number of books and writings. But still, he is not a part of our, say, mainstream. And to put him in the right place would be important. And so I try to pick up names of different people. Some of them completely, not only that I don't know enough about them, but possibly nobody knows enough about them. That some of the what I can say about them is a great amount of speculation. Speculation about what happened, who were they, and really what happened afterwards. So all these things are things that are a part of a period that is, in a way, it's basically a period which is between the time of after the more or less when the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, has been edited basically and is a complete body of knowledge, and the time of what we call sometimes the Rishonim, the great scholars of the Middle Ages. Now, of the Middle Ages, of the later Middle Ages, which means there are names that we know more, we use more, and sometimes we know also at least about the period in many of these cases, and sometimes we know also about the personalities. With some of the people, we just know a name. We don't know what kind of person it was. In some cases, we know about what the person did, but we don't know really who was he. See, it is sometimes what I'm trying to do is not to give you a kind of a list of, say, I'm also not good at doing it of those gilded plastic heroes. I think that Jews, in general, our history and our reading of history is not. We don't have those gilded pictures. We don't have what are called all kinds of artificial saints. So we have people, and we know the ups and downs and differences of personality. And this list, which contains different kinds of people, it will be perhaps for you kind of jumping from a person who was in a way a political leader to a person who was basically a great creative person, and vice versa. So it will be at least not boring in that sense. Now, if I will be boring, it's my fault. But otherwise, I'll try not to have it this way. So that's about the period. And I say, of course, I could pick up more people of the time, but not that easily. Not that easily, because we have names sometimes. We don't know much about these names. We have, for example, from the time in Babylonia, it's called the time of the Geonim. So we have some lists, not complete ones, but we have lists of the Geonim. But with some of them, we just know there is a list, one of them made later, so we know at what period this man raised to this position and what time he died. In between, very little, just names. And some of these names we really don't have. We don't know anything about them except that they existed. About some others, we have a little bit more meat to deal with. But generally speaking, this is a time. It's a time that is historically there was no great historian who wrote about the periods, and even later on, nobody really created a picture of life in that time. Surely not in those areas. See, let me just to give you some kind of a notion. In this period of time lived also, say, Rashi in a different part of the world. But Rashi and his descendants and his disciples, they created a picture which has a kind of a unity. It has some kind of a it makes sense. About other people, we have just sporadic names. We don't really know what were the relationships. In some cases, I'll come to it about the relationship between, say, Rabbi so and his father-in-law. Sometimes it's a part of the story. Sometimes we don't know even about that. We don't know about them. We don't know about their families from or where they came from. All this is just a kind of a period, as many periods that we have in our history, in which we have such. I don't know. Let me assume. It's an assumption that I found out unluckily not to be real. The assumption about that people somehow know the Bible, Jews. Now the point is that basically, one of my definitions. Please excuse me. My definition is one of the definitions. Who is a Jew? Is something like this: a person that will proudly tell you that he never read the Bible. Now, a Goy won't be proud about it. But a Jew may be proudly say that he never read the Bible. And sometimes, whether he's proud or not proud, he did not. So he doesn't know anything about it. See, even in the Bible, we have periods in which we have a not only a historical story, but we have people that we can sometimes fall in love with, or hate, or write novels about. See, there are such people that we have. See, there are, to give you one example, nobody really wrote a novel about biblical heroes that was comparable to the original. See, but there are some better novels. Some are trash, but still you have pictures, you have images, you have people there that are. See, you can fall in love with the King David. He was possibly. Some people even have a theory that his name David is not his real name. But David meant something like the beloved, because it seems that lots of people were in love with him, men and women alike were in love with him. But you can't remain indifferent to him. And there are other people that you can hate completely, or at least not understand. I met a girl, just a little girl, which I didn't want to ask her parents why they called the girl Atalia. Atalia. So why? Why should the girl be named after a person who was, at best, she was crazy. In other ways, she was perhaps even more complex and complicated. But so why should you give a name like this? It's maybe just because somebody picks up a name of a list without knowing what it means. But that is something else, and that's now about the period we are speaking about. Now, in this period, we have far less material. We don't really know what kind of a person was so and so. I'm not speaking only about things about which we basically don't know. In other cultures, we have some images, even physical images. How did so and so look like? See, was he short or tall? Was he what they call, was he handsome or ugly? We have in the Talmudic period, we have stories about so-and-so was extremely fat. So we know it was an extremely fat man. So we know about him. We know about somebody that was very tall. We know about some that were like Rabbi Yochanan Bar Nafcha, who was extremely beautiful. You see, extremely so. So we know we have not yet what I call the sayings and what I call the teachings, but we have some images. How were they? Now, when we come to this period, and in most of the Jewish period, how did Rashi look? Was he a little short guy? See, and perhaps what I call with a squint in his eye, or was Rashi a big person that everybody admired that looks? See, we don't really know, because it seems that at those times our writers of history usually didn't write anything about it. They didn't care. Why should you care about how a person looked like? But in some ways it is important. In more ways it is sometimes what kind of personality did they have? But we get some of the pictures from the writings, from the stories about people. We can get some kind of an image. Now, those heroes that I was speaking about are most of them people that are enigmas. See, I'm going to speak tonight about Bustanai. What did he look like? What did he look like? What kind of a personality he had? I can sometimes infer some of these things from there, but still I am, and I must tell you that unluckily, what I'll have to do is partially. I'm not doing it always willingly, but partially I'll have to do fiction. See, because I don't have enough facts. So I have to make fiction and to make sometimes something my images. See, look at the biblical times. We had our two mothers, Rachel and Leah. At least we have some description. See, even though, just for your benefit, the Rashbam thinks that one of the differences between the two sisters was that Rachel was a brunette, and Leah was a blonde. So it's possible not the images you have, but he tried to infer from what is written that one was. So they were unlike each other in looks, but still we have some kind of something to touch about. Now, about the people that's what I'm speaking about. Not only just how do they look like, if I would meet them in the street, would I recognize them? But sometimes I don't know very little about them, so I have to create some of the things. But I will try to tell you when I am just doing creative work. Okay. Now Bustanai. Bustanai was a Rosh Galuta. Rosh Galuta was a position. It was called in other languages. It's called exilar. The Rosh Galuta had an official appointment as the head of the Jews in the realm that was Mesopotamia and sometimes many other countries around it. So he was the political chief of the Jews and representing them in a way to the government, but also he was considered as a prince. They were real Jewish princes. See, this was a real prince, because among other things, because those exilars are one long dynasty. It is cut and jumps from one person to another, but basically it's a dynasty of people that all of them are direct descendants from the last surviving king the descendants of David. So the real princes were called, for us, they were the real royal princes. See, they were kings they were princes of the house of David, all of them. See, and this was they gave him a position for the Jews, and not only for the Jews, as princes. They are not simple people. They are not people that were chosen by whoever it was, but there were people they had their own what they called their own greatness that was embedded in their genealogy, in their lineage. So this was a lineage that everybody could had somehow respect for, more or less, but everybody had respect for. So Bostanai was Rosh HaGolah. Rosh HaGolah, this was the Jewish title for the head of the exile, but exile mostly on the land northern to Eretz Israel, and they were considered also among Jews. They were political leaders, as political leaders. Now, who were they as people? They were different people. Some of them were considered a great tzaddikim, and some of them were far from it. See, some of them were important in creating things, and some of them were just sitting on what I call it great grandeur. They were grand lords, among other things. They were mostly living, and we'll come to it because that's the important time. When they lived under the government of the Persians, which was to be exact, they were first. The first Mesopotamia and Iran were ruled first by different dynasty and different nation of Parthians, with a TH. So the Parthians were one dynasty. Then came a more Iranian Persian dynasty, the Achaemenids that were later on. And for them, we have it from some sources, they were considered in the government, in the Persian government, their position was they were the fourth rank in the government. And there was the king, the Shah, whatever it was called, and the Rosh HaGolah was number 4 in the hierarchy. So they were for the authorities, they were great princes. And they had the position, and they were what they call, they were friendly, or not friendly, but anyway, they were always they had to do with the kings of the realm, because they were not. Very rarely in other places we had Jews that had such a position, but they had the hereditary position of rulers of the Jewish people. Now, the Jews, because they were they were the descendants of David, held them in great respect, and in the time when they are referred to, when they are mentioned. Usually, they are mentioned always with the title Mar, which is master so and so, or Maran, or Marana. So this was the title. Some of them could and have been rabbis in that time, but basically this was the title. And the title was a master. They were the masters of the Jews, and they had also officially, from the government, they had the power to execute justice over the Jews. So the Jews in the realm were really under them. And so this was one part. Let me just add, almost as a beginning for the next. Later on, we had a kind of a double government. There were the two great yeshivot of Babylonia, Sura and Pumbedita. The heads of those yeshivot that were called later Geonim had also a very high position. And usually the Geonim and Rosh HaGolah, they were the rulers of the Jewry there. So in a very clear way, the relationships between them were not always the same. I mean, sometimes the Geonim were much more powerful because of personality, and sometimes the Rosh HaGolah was a much more powerful person, and the Rosh Yeshiva is an unknown person. In the list of it was a Rosh Yeshiva, but basically it was a three-part government. Two Geonim and Rosh HaGolah, they were the rulers of Judaism. I'm mentioning it among other things because this is, in most times, when we had any kind of there was a Jewish autonomy, practically, up to the time of emancipation. There was some Jewish autonomy, and Jews had a right of a certain amount of self-rule, which depended very much on the politics, on the period, and on the religion of the rulers. But basically, it was there. But it was never something that was completely official. In Babylonia at that time, see, the Rosh HaGolah was officially the head of the Jews. It wasn't just a title, an empty title. It was a real title with real power. Possibly the Rosh HaGolah not only could execute justice, he or other people under him, but seemingly they had the power of dealing with the culprits by punishing them in different ways, including perhaps a capital punishment. So they were really powerful princes, and they could, and they did from time to time use it. They seemingly, from time to time, it was done later on in other places. The people that were offenders in one way or another sometimes had been ordered to cut their heads. So it's not a nice Jewish way, but they did it. See? There were people that the Rosh HaGolah ordered to cut his head or to kill him. So it's a government. Now, I'm speaking now about Bustanai, not just because he's a person that was in himself a legend, but also because he lived politically in a most interesting time. We know more or less, we don't know exact dates, surely not about his birth, but it's about something like 620 to about 680. That's about the period, since 7th century, which was, politically speaking, a very important point in history. This was the time when the Arabs began to conquer the Eastern world. So Bustanai was the person who was really in the change of governments, from the Persian government to the Arab government, and it is a very important because of that itself. It is important to remember him, because you see, you have an upheaval. The whole world is changing. The religion of the world is changing. The rulers of the world are changing. See, instead of those traditional rulers that were in many countries, say in Palestine, in Egypt, later on, about the same time in North Africa, but also in Iraq, Syria, Iran. Those people, it would be an interesting speculation, but I'm not going into it. How could they manage? There was basically not such a great people, but how did they manage to conquer a world and create an empire that was as great as some of the greatest empires in the history of the world? So, but they were there, and everything was changed. The old laws, the old customs, even in so many ways, the old language changed. So they came in and they swept everything before them, and it became a new world. Now, Bustanai, which, first of all, the name Bustanai is not a real proper name. It's seemingly a kind of a nickname. What his real name was, some think that he was called Hanina. It seems to be unlikely because whatever we know about him it was this Bustanai ben Haninai. That was his name. Now, Bustanai means, Bustan is in Persian a garden, an orchard. So he was called Bustanai because of a story connected with the garden. But this is the name that he's known for in history, in his time and for many hundreds of years later. So this was Bustanai, the story. And now I'm saying, whether the story is, now we have very few sources, and the story is that the last king of the Persian Empire decided to destroy these rulers, the exilarchs, the Rashi Gola, to destroy all of them. And so he killed all those that he could lay hands on, which was commonplace in those times. Now we do it in different ways, but in those times it was done. And so the story is that the only one that remained of the family of David was an unborn baby. This Bustanai was then just he was not born yet, and the story goes that the king of Persia had a dream that he enters into a garden and he's with an axe and cuts off the trees, one tree after the other, and then when he comes to the last tree, an old man comes and stops him. Don't cut this tree. And the story is that the king was unhappy about the dream. And he asked, in fact, a Jewish scholar, what is the meaning of the dream? And the Jewish scholar told him that what you saw is really the family of David. And the old man that you saw is the King David. And he urged you not to cut the tree, not to cut the last tree. So the little child was spared and was allowed to go. And this was Bustanai, who was the heir as Rosh Gola for the kingdom. He was in fact born into being a prince. So that is the story, and therefore this is because of the garden that the king saw. He is called the child of the garden, Bustanai. That is the story that is found in some of those sources that remained from those times. Anyway, there seems to be some need to explain such a name, which is not a name. So it's something like the garden boy, the orchard boy, say something like this. That was the name Bustanai. Incidentally, in modern times, there are here and there children called Bustanai. Not very many. Don't know why. Possibly because it's uncommon, and also because the story is not well known. Now, so Bustanai was seemingly, he grew up, and after, when he was about 16, he assumed ruler, to be a ruler. Somebody before that was somebody that was the fellow who really was his guardian. But later on he became the ruler, and then he was introduced to the king. Now, one of the things is, seemingly, he had a presence. We don't know about it, but he clearly had a presence. Now, there is another story about him that we don't have real evidence about it. And there's a story that he's standing before the king as a subject, and then a fly comes and stands just on his eye. And Bustanai didn't move. his tent without moving, with a fly bothering him. Nothing. He doesn't try to drive on. And then the king asked him, why doesn't he do what naturally a person should do? And he said that he learned from his forefathers that when you are in the presence of a king, you are not allowed to move any part of your body without getting permission. So he didn't move. So the king was impressed, and he gave him, and they say that it was the sign of the Rosh Hashanah. From those times on, the seal of Rosh Hashanah had an image of a fly. So that was the image that he earned. Now, the story went on. So he was there, seemingly whatever it was. He was there. We don't know much about his doings, but possibly he tried to gather his principality, his power, his whatever it was. And then, within his times of ruling, then came the Arab invasion. The Arabs invaded Iran, first Iraq, which was under Iranian rule. They invaded it and conquered it, and then they invaded Iran, and at the end they conquered completely the country. The Sultan or the Khalif, Khalif of those times was the Sultan Omar. Even though, just as a correction, it is the mosque that is called mosque on the Temple Mountain, that is called after the name of Omar, is not his. Even though they tried to move it backwards to those times. Seemingly, the rebuilder of the mosque was a few hundred years later, another Omar. Even if you go in the old city, you will see the street that is near the David Citadel. It's called Umar ibn Khattab Street. That is his name, because he was clearly, again, the head of the army that conquered Eretz Israel. So he was one of the great conquerors of the world. And so he came also, he went on, and again his armies really devastated almost everything that was in there, including the Persian Empire. It was an empire. It was strong enough to withstand. It was always in fights with Rome or with Byzantium later. But they were never completely conquered. Sometimes they were the conquerors. And so they kept more or less the country, the land, and everything else as their realm. Which again was possibly, it included Mesopotamia, Iraq of our times, and Iran, and some of the countries beyond it, which is now Central Asia. So almost to the borders of India. Depended on the times, but it was a great kingdom. And this kingdom was conquered by the Arabs. Conquered by the Arabs with the Arab rule, and this King Umar, I mean, he was the ruler, even though he wasn't officially. He was called Khalif, which means the replacement of Muhammad. That's the meaning of the title, replacement of Muhammad. But at least he was the ruler of the whole vast country and the army and everything in it. And then there was a meeting that he had with the Jews. It was the first time in which the Arabs encountered a big Jewish population. They had some Jews in Arabia. They tried to drive them out. They did as they're apt to do, and they sometimes mention it. They made all kinds of treaties and contracts with the Jews, but they really didn't keep any of them. See, when they had enough power, they drove out or killed the Jews that they could. So Arabia was, in a certain way, most of it was clean of Jews. Now, in Iraq and Iran, there was a big Jewish population. We don't know the numbers, but there were surely hundreds of thousands of Jews. It wasn't easy to get rid of them. And more than that, it seems that the Jews had enough of the Persian rule. And Mustafa himself would just escape being killed by the ruler. And so they didn't trust the Persians. So when the Arabs came, the Jews collaborated. The Jews collaborated with the Arabs. And so it was important politically, important militarily that it came. Certain things like this happened in other places, possibly in Spain as well, and in North Africa as well. But basically it was the Jews collaborated, and the new Caliph, who is now the ruler of the whole country, meets Mustafa. Now this, we don't know again details of the meeting, but see, as I am saying, historically speaking, politically speaking, see, it's a new realm, it's a new government. They could destroy everything. They didn't do it too much because they were inexperienced, so they had to rely on the social and military and political structure that was before them. But still, it was something new, and they could do whatever they wanted with the position of the Jews. It was really, the Jews were an autonomy, an autonomy that wasn't always so malleable, so easy to rule. They had before that one or two big revolts of Jewish leaders, including one of the Rashi Gola. I didn't talk about them, but they in fact created a little Jewish kingdom in Persia. So they were strong enough to do so, and so the Jews were some kind of a power. And Umar decided first that he keeps the status quo. The Jews keep their autonomy, under the Muslim law and other, but basically they keep their autonomy. They keep the Rosh Gola as their prince, as their leader. And now we don't know details about it. We know one thing, that is one of the facts. It seems that Mustanai, as I say, even from his first meeting with the Persian king, but at least this meeting that is a fact with the Arab overruler, it seems to be that he was an extraordinary person. See, I mean that captivated the people that met him. So not only did the Caliph granted him the rule, but did something very unusual. It seems that the last Persian king had, we are not sure about it, whether it was 2 daughters that remained after him, or 2 granddaughters. Again, princesses of the royal house of Persia. And so, the Caliph Umar took one of them as a wife, which is, she could be what, I don't know how she looks like. I mean, no description about it, but I suppose she couldn't be terribly ugly. But more than that, see, it's also a political matter that the new king, takes the daughter of the old ruler. So it is a feeling, it's a continuation of the rule. It's not a break. It's not a complete revolution. Now, this was one daughter. The second daughter he gave to Mustafa. So Mustafa was given the other princess, the other Persian princess, as a wife. So we have here, incidentally, you can see the unusual feat. See, it is surely not the part of the work of the Khalif to do so, to find a wife for Bustanai. There is a story which I don't think it can be held that Bustanai was unmarried at that time. I don't think that they cared very much as Muslims, as people from the East, whether he's married or not married. But he gave him the other daughter, which means she becomes, in some way, he's the Khalif's brother-in-law, which is, you see, it is a very unusual situation. Unusual because you see, here you have this Jewish ruler is becoming not just that he's tolerated, but he's given a very high person. It's not an official position to be the king's brother-in-law, but it's a very practical, very, very high position. So in that sense, you see, the fact that Bustanai was there, and the fact that Bustanai married this daughter, meant not only, it meant that the whole system will continue. And so it was for many hundreds of years it continued. The Rosh HaGolah under the Muslim rulers, and they changed from one house to another house, from blood dynasty, but still the Exilach, the Jewish ruler, was still the prince of the Jews, and say a very high official in this time. Now, as I'm saying, when I speak about it in a historical view, it means not only that the old system continued, but the old system was in a way enhanced and enforced by that. It's a big change because it means that the Jews got not just the official religious tolerance, but they got also a position in the state. This was created at those times, and as I said, the state changed many a time, but these Jewish princes remained the rulers of the Jews. With the relationship with the kings were not always even, but still they were the rulers of the Jews. So historically speaking, it is the man Bustanai is not just a person that was just standing between two periods. Bustanai was the person that really made it possible to continue the whole system, to continue the rule of the house of David, to continue the system of the Jewish autonomy. So all that is, as I say, even if we wouldn't know anything else about him, it just means that he's the person that kept which in a time of real upheaval, when everything was collapsing. So this remained stable. So the Jewish prince remained in his position. The Jewish autonomy remained in its former power, and that meant for the Jews in that area. Perhaps they were basically much better off than they were under the Persian rule. But a part of it was because the rulers needed them. They were collaborating with the new rulers. That is one thing. They didn't have any sentiment for the Persian rulers. That were, many times they had very hard times under them for religious and other reasons. So they didn't have a sentiment. But still, you have a whole group of people, an important group of people, some of them very rich, some of them very important artisans, doctors, scientists of those times, that were connected to the new rule. But still, it means he did something that very few people did, which is to continue, to keep the continuation of his position, which wasn't just his personal position, but it was the position of the person who is continuing the system. The system continues with Bustanai. Now, just to add to it, which is, it's perhaps, I'm not sure if it's a nice story, but that story is very well documented. Bustanai married married this girl, whatever she was. And they had children from her. So there were children that were, on one hand, they were Jewish princes, on the other hand, they were Persian princes. But they were the children. Now, some time passed, and then the children of Bustanai's Jewish wife came with a notion, see, that these boys or young people or their descendants, they are really not Jews. They are just simple goyim. See, they have a Goyish mother. The mother is a goy. She was princess, but for the Jews that didn't really matter very much. So they are simple goyim, and as goyim that were raised in a Jewish home, they are slaves. And they wanted to treat them as slaves. So that went at those times, and many years later, it came into the courts of the Geonim. Because you see, it was on one hand a family quarrel, but on the other hand, it had not only, I suppose, monetary ramifications, but also some political ramifications and others. What do you do with these children? So, the main point was, because it was those times, what was the status of this princess? And the rabbis made a decision that because we know Bustanai, and he was a righteous person, he surely wouldn't marry a Goyish girl. So it's sure that he converted her. We don't have document, but it's surely that he wouldn't be like this. And so it is a sure thing that she was converted. And so they ruled accordingly, and the children kept there within the family with their old position. So they were so in fact, with the times, later generations, see the story remained alive, and the disagreement between the two parts of the family were there, and from time to time it appeared. So many years, perhaps 100 years later, when one of the Geonim writes a letter, and he writes about the same thing. He says, "We are descendants also of Rosh Hagolah, and we are descendants of his Jewish wife." So he made it a point of a Jewish wife, not of a non-Jewish wife. So for many generations, it was some kind of a memory, and for some people it was important, because if you mention it 200 years later, it seems that it was a subject of discussion. But as we know later on, first that some of these descendants of the Persian princes became Rashi Gola on their own, so nobody stopped them. And later on, that even some of the later time Geonim were the descendants of these what they call princes. So in that sense, even though it finished with the story, but this is a story about which we have names. We know the name of the wife. She surely had a Persian name. See, we know the name of the wife, and we know even some of the names of the descendants that were later on living there. So all in all, that was a quaint conclusion to the story. That was, in a certain way, just to tell you, it was based not on any kind of clear proof, but it was connected with the notion that Bustanai was a righteous person. Bustanai wouldn't do some irregularity in his own home. So if he was married to her and there's children by her, it's surely everything was all right. So they trusted me enough in the later years that everything was all right. So the story has, in that sense, I would say, perhaps it's a happy end of the story. The story of the Jewish prince and the Persian captive. See, it could be a nice material for if some of you. I don't know if any of you has any aptitude or any desire. It could be a nice subject for poetry, or even for a short story. Let's imagine the whole picture there. But going back to it, and I'm trying to more or less to summarize the thing. So you see, what I mentioned, what I brought in the name of Hustenai, this was the kind of an end of the story. His marrying of this wife and his having children and what happened during the ages. But what was important was that historically speaking, it meant I don't know how much, and we don't have enough material to describe it. I'm sure that in a certain way, even this kind of a marriage had something to do also with the Persians in the country. See, because in a certain way, the descendants of Hustenai are also the descendants of their last king. So it meant something for the people that the relationship between them and the Jews had to be, I would say, more friendly because of that. So in that, even though I'm sure that Hustenai wouldn't dare to offer to get this girl for himself on his own, but it was a gift of the king. And you cannot say no when the king gives you a gift, especially when the gift is possibly a nice, good-looking woman. So it didn't say no. But as I'm saying again, what I try to say, here we have a person that we don't know much about him. What were his other deeds? But clearly, he was the man that was there in a time of a change, in a time in which the world was shaking, not only shaking, breaking up, and he was there, and he, at least for the Jewish part, he held the continuation of the lines of the princes of David. I'll come later. One of the people that I'm going to mention is possibly the last known person of this line. But it took hundreds of years until it happened. So for the time being, you have here, he was in the middle of the period, and in that period he was the man who consolidated the position of the Jews, the position of the ruling house, and the whole notion of the Jewish autonomy. This was a very important thing because at those times there was the great yeshivot, the great center. It was the greatest center of learning, the greatest Jewish center that spread from there to all over the world. So he kept it there. So I suppose it's worthwhile to remember him as a person, as some kind, when I mentioned the King David, it was just because it seems that the King David had also this quality, and also this politics of keeping the tie to the old ruling house, which he was very, very clear in trying to keep it. But it was also because those people they loved him. Now Hustenai seems to have this quality because it came to his help when he was under the Persians. but his position was unclear. It came to his help under the Arabs, which was a completely different way. And the ability to bind these things together. It means he is not well known, but we don't have many people who had the same kind of important position. See, he is standing between two worlds. One is collapsing and one is being created, and he keeps, at least his part of it is kept for the next, I would say, at least more than 300 years of continuation, which is for a royal dynasty, and for the life of people, it's a very long time. So that is for in the glory of Jerusalem. Okay.